Hi folks, in the final video of this combo, we will look more closely at input materials and how to select them, at least from lexical perspectives. There has been much research into the role of lexical coverage in second language reading comprehension. A strong relationship has been demonstrated between receptive vocabulary knowledge and second language reading comprehension, with correlation ranging from 0.40 to 0.85. The relationship between lexical coverage and reading comprehension had also been addressed with the earliest research by Laufer in 1989, suggesting that 95% lexical coverage was needed to allow adequate second language reading comprehension. A score of 55% on her reading test would consider adequate comprehension, and at the 95% coverage level, there was significantly more participants with a score above than below 55%. In a later study, Hugh and Nation in 2000 suggested that readers needed knowledge of 98% of words in a fiction text to achieve successful comprehension. In this study, the coverage of a fiction text was manipulated by replacing words with non-words. 4 different coverage degrees were created, and second language readers' comprehension of this text was tested. At the 80% coverage level, no learner achieved adequate understanding, as defined by a score of 70 out of the maximum score of 124 points. And at 100% coverage level, the majority did. Relatively few gained adequate comprehension of the text with 90 and 95% coverage. Hugh and Nation therefore concluded that the required coverage was somewhere between 95 and 100% and suggested a figure of 90% as an optimum threshold for adequate comprehension. The two above studies attempted to identify a coverage threshold at which adequate comprehension of written text can be achieved. Smith and his colleagues in 2011 took a different approach, investigating its percentage point of coverage between 90 and 100% in an attempt to describe the overall relationship curve between coverage and comprehension. This revealed a linear relationship between the two, which suggests that the coverage level required depends on the degree of comprehension aimed for. Based on the data, if 60% comprehension is the goal, 90% lexical coverage is needed. Laufer and Ravenhouse-Karlovsky in 2010 supports this argument of basing the required coverage level on the comprehension with 4. The author suggests the two lexical coverage thresholds can be identified depending on the definition of adequate comprehension. They are 98% as the optimal and 59% as the minimal. Based on the performance of their EFL participants, the author concludes that 95% lexical coverage enables an acceptable comprehension level, and 98% of lexical coverage leads to successful comprehension of most learners. These lexical coverage figures are crucial because they allow calculation of the vocabulary size which speakers need in order to use language. For example, Nation in 2006 calculated that it takes a vocabulary size of 8 to 9,000 word families to reach a 98% lexical coverage in written text. Similarly, Laufer and Ravenhouse-Karlovsky in 2010 calculated that it takes around 8,000 word families to yield a coverage of 98%, including proper nouns, but only about 4 to 5,000 word family to reach a 95% lexical coverage. Although the lexical coverage and vocabulary size requirements seem relatively established for the second language reading, It is far from the case for the second language listening. We could find only 2 public studies focusing on this area. Bong in 2000 was the first to address, albeit indirectly, the issue of lexical coverage in relation to the second language listening comprehension. In his study, participants listened to 4 short passages with increasing percentages of the low-frequency words. Their lexical knowledge was measured with a dictation test, and their comprehension level was measured with a written free recall test. It was found that higher dictation score generally meant better listening comprehension, with a modest correlation of 0.45 being reported. A lexical threshold was not found, as there was considerable amount of variation in comprehension scores. In general, however, learners with the lexical coverage score below 90% show poor comprehension, and those with lexical coverage score above 95% show good comprehension. However, there are issues with the Bong's instruments that call his findings into question. First, knowledge of words in the listening passages was measured by a dictation test. It is unclear to what extent such an integrative assessment method, drawing on many phases of linguistic knowledge, directly measures vocabulary knowledge. Secondly, to measure comprehension, the participants were asked to write down everything they recalled from the listening passages. These accounts were then rated on a 4-point scale. This introduced a level of subjectivity to the marking. More importantly, the scale was a relatively blunt measure, especially as the construction of the rating scale was guided by a desire to separate those with a rating of 1 or 2, referring to some kind of inferior comprehension, from those of 3 or 4, referring to good comprehension. This issue makes it difficult to draw any strong conclusion about the precise relationship between lexical coverage and listening comprehension from Bong's study. A recent study by Steyer in 2009 looked at the effects of vocabulary size and the depth on listening comprehension. Participant comprehension was assessed with a standardized test from the Cambridge Certificate of Proficiency in English. Their vocabulary size could measure with the vocabulary level test, and the depth of vocabulary knowledge with a slightly adapted version of the word associate test. Steyer found that both size and depth correlated significantly with listening comprehension, with a coefficient of 0.70 and 0.65 respectively. In addition, he indirectly explores the lexical coverage and listening comprehension relationship. Although he did not have a lexical coverage measure, he estimated it by submitting his listening passages to a vocabulary profiler analysis on Complete Lexical Tutor website developed by Tomcorp, and then match the frequency profiles to the participant vocabulary level test scores. For example, participants who master the vocabulary level test score of 3000 level were assumed to have the vocabulary to achieve about 94% lexical coverage of the listening passage, and those participants produced a mean of nearly 60% on the listening comprehension test. Participants who master the 5000 level with an assumed 98% lexical coverage of the listening input material achieved a mean listening score of 73%. Although indicative, Steyer's indirect method of measuring lexical coverage makes it hard to make any strong conclusion concerning the relationship between lexical coverage and listening comprehension. It is clear that the two studies above have not provided an empirical basis on which to establish a lexical coverage percentage which allows adequate listening comprehension. This is problematic because in the absence of an empirically defined threshold, the tendency has been to simply use the lexical coverage figures from reading research and assume that they also work for listening comprehension. However, there is research which indicates that the influence of vocabulary knowledge differs in the two modalities, at least in the second language case. McCarthy in 2000, for example, studied lexical and grammatical knowledge in both reading and listening comprehension and found that vocabulary knowledge explained a larger amount of variance in reading than in listening. Similarly, Stair in 2008 found that vocabulary size correlated more strongly with reading and writing abilities than the skill of listening. A recent study by Mepur and Rahimi in 2010 investigated the effects of both general and text-specific vocabulary knowledge on reading and listening comprehension. It appeared that learners' general vocabulary knowledge influenced their reading comprehension, but not their listening comprehension. In contrast, familiarity with text-specific vocabulary, tested by giving half of the participants a glossary with keyword definitions, had a significantly effect on both reading and listening comprehension scores, with a stronger effect on reading comprehension. It is clear from the study reviewed above that lexical coverage plays an important role in both listening and reading comprehension. A lexical coverage from 95 to 98% is believed to help second language learners to generate an adequate understanding of input content. This threshold can be used for selection of input material for language courses. Using LexTutor to select and tailor input material for English courses. As second language teachers and course designers, we have to answer the question whether reading and listening materials that we use are too difficult to our students. In what follows, I would like to introduce an effective tool to answer such a question, at least from lexical perspective. This tool is the website lextutor.ca, developed by Tom Cobb and his colleagues. Before we examine the lexical load of a given tag, we need to identify the entering vocabulary knowledge of our students. First, we go to website above and then click on the test button. Here, we can use either vocabulary size test or vocabulary level test to have an estimate of our student entering vocabulary size or level respectively. This estimate is presented in the form of frequency-based 1,000 word families. For example, if a student successfully completes the 2,000 or 3,000 levels in the test, he or she is estimated to have a receptive knowledge of 2,000 or 3,000 most frequency word families in English. Now, we move on to examine the lexical load of a written or spoken text. We go to the same website. However, this time we first click on the vocab profile button, and then the BNC20 button. In a new window appears like this. Now, we clear the instruction and paste your text in. Finally, we click on the submit button and have the result. Here is one example of a result report. The text proved to be relatively difficult to our students because a receptive knowledge of 3,000 most frequent word families in English, for instance, only allowed them to have a mere lexical coverage of 92.42%, a combination of 80.97% for the 3,000 word family and 3.45% forms the obliques for the proper nouns. Therefore, the text should be replaced by another one or tailored to meet the minimum threshold of 95% mentioned above. In the latter case, we need to know which words in the given text need modifying. In the window of the result report, we scroll down and then find a list of in-text word families which are organized according to frequency-based 1,000 word family levels. Therefore, the words that go beyond the 3,000 word family level, such as linear, threshold, or optimum, should be replaced by synonyms of higher frequency or pre-taught before the student come to reading. By now, I do hope that you have been able to identify the strengths and weaknesses of English text and explain why they need to adapt textbook materials. Weigh the advantages and disadvantages of using linguistic corpora in language classroom, and use programs in the website lextutor.ca to modify reading and listening materials in textbook. All the best with your future practice with this website, and thank you.